His Excellency has accepted my advice and the election will be held on the 3rd of October. The main issue in this election campaign will be that of economic competence. The main issue will be...
It's just over 2 years into his first term, and John Howard has taken the country to another election. In that short time, he has seized the mantle of economic credibility away from Labor and rewritten the argument about who could be trusted to manage the economy.
We have turned a deficit inherited from Mr Beazley and Mr Keating of $10.5 billion into a surplus a year earlier than predicted. We have delivered the lowest interest rates in 30 years for both home buyers and small business. We have delivered the lowest inflation rate in the OECD area.
The memory of Labor's reforms while in government was suddenly distant, and the constant reminder of the devastating recession of the 90s were kept fresh in the mind of voters by Howard and his Treasurer, Peter Costello.
When our government came to office, Labor had the Commonwealth government on a path of deficit and debt right into the next century. Australia was going backwards. Our debts were escalating.
Economic management became the major selling point for Howard in every election from there on in.
Labor had you pay for their economic incompetence time and time again. And if they got back in, they'll make you pay for it again. Don't go back to Labor. Australia just can't afford it.
Authorised by Old Crosby for the Liberal Party, Canberra.
I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. This is The Howard Effect, a 3-part series marking 30 years since John Howard's emphatic election victory. Today, author Amy Remeikis on the economic revolution that defined his government, the tax reforms, the housing settings, and the policy choices that helped create the Australia we are all still living in. This is episode 2, In the Shadows of the Australian Dream. Amy, what was Howard's pitch on the economy and why did it work?
Howard's pitch on the economy is one that would be very familiar to voters no matter what age they are, and that is fixing Labor's black hole.
Labor left us, despite all the protestations of Mr Beazley and Mr Keating, a deficit of $10.5 billion. And we turned that into a surplus a year ahead of schedule.
And Howard's greatest trick was, along with Peter Costello, his long-term loyal treasurer, was teaching Australians that the household budget was very similar to the Commonwealth budget and that you didn't put things on the credit card and debt was bad and surplus or savings was good.
In periods of growth, we must put away savings for the downturns. But far from saving, the previous government kept ratcheting up our debts, spending money it didn't have.
And as Paul Keating would famously say to Mark Latham, that, Howard and Costello had been slapped on the arse by a rainbow because they came to government around the same time as a once-in-a-generation mining boom, which meant that not only did they have all of this resource money coming in, they also had an increase of tax receipts that has virtually been unseen in Australia, since. And that meant they had a lot of money to spend, and they did spend while also managing to have a surplus.
Here in Western Australia, evidence of the mining boom is everywhere you look. This is the capital, Perth. As you can see, the skyline's dominated by cranes building new office space for companies like Chevron, BHP, Rio Tinto and Woodside.
The legend of Howard, the steady economic manager, was forged in the glow of the resources boom. Soaring commodity prices, swelling tax receipts and budget surpluses. Yet history looks different when reviewing the record of his time as Treasurer in the Fraser years.
The thing about all of this, though, is that when we think of Howard, we think of that truism that he was a great economic manager. But a lot of people don't actually go back to when he was Treasurer himself in the Malcolm Fraser government. When he finished his tenure in 1983, inflation was running at about 11%, unemployment was sitting around 10%, and yes, he was dealing with the hangovers of stagflation, which was, a global financial crisis that swept most of the industrialized world. But it also is the time when he got the nickname Honest John.
Does John Howard believe, who wants to paint himself as Honest John, is this the sort of honesty that we can expect in Australian politics from the alternative?
Which was meant as a derogative term for him, because he often would not tell the truth about what was going on with the budget. And that's all down to the fact that he was slapped in the arse by a rainbow with the mining boom. And he essentially used that to teach Australians that I can give you all of the tax cuts in the world and also deliver surpluses. Aren't I amazing? And we know 30 years on that is not the case, and all of that spending that he did is a massive reason of why the budget's in the position it is today.
Out of all the economic reforms cemented into what would become known as middle-class welfare, it was his changes to taxes relating to housing investment that are still being felt by generations of Australians today.
The really big thing that he hated was the capital gains tax that Hawke had put in place. He really hated it. But by the time that he got into a leadership position where he could address that, it had been baked into the tax system so much that he couldn't get rid of it. So what he and Costello did was they came up with the capital gains tax discount, which is 50%. So if you sell a house, 50% of that profit is essentially tax-free, is the most simple way to explain that. And what that did was it completely turbocharged the housing market, because it suddenly made investment in housing a sure bet.
To encourage investment, the capital gains tax has been virtually halved, with special provisions for those in small business who've worked hard all of their lives and want to retire on the proceeds of their effort and hard work.
And he essentially laid it out that this was the way for mums and dads to build further wealth, that this way they could then extend that wealth by buying a second house that would help set them and their children up for the future. And it had almost an immediate impact on housing prices in Australia. He would say that no one was complaining to him about their house prices going up.
I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me and say, Howard, I'm angry with you for letting the value of my house increase.
And it also had the added benefit for him of entrenching those battlers, because they suddenly saw their houses increase in value, which added to their individual wealth. But between 2002 and 2004, prices increased by more than 40% in Sydney, nearly 65% in Brisbane, and almost 30% in Melbourne. It was so immediate that by 2004, the Productivity Commission was warning about the impact of this policy on the housing stock and what it meant for housing prices. But Howard and Costello were so worried about the backlash from those middle-class voters that they didn't want to do anything, even though we knew as early as the 2000s that this was having a detrimental impact on housing costs for the future.
Howard was secure in his own narrative around housing prices, and the fact that removing a tax benefit that created wealth for his battlers was a line no government could cross without betraying the very people it claimed to represent. Its impact on future generations was of no immediate political consequence.
He completely deflected from it almost immediately, and there's a phone call with ABC 612 Brisbane radio, in the early 2000s, where an older woman named Phyllis rings up to speak to the Prime Minister on the morning show. And she was talking about how worried she was for her children and grandchildren being able to afford a house. And Howard very famously says, no one is coming up to me in the street and complaining about their house prices going up. And she said, well, let me be the first. I want to complain because I want to downsize my property, but I am buying and selling in the same market, and what I would want to buy is almost as much as what I'm selling my house for. But I'm also very worried about what my grandchildren are going to be able to do. And Howard just deflects from this. He's just like, no, this is a good thing for Australia. Everyone's going to become more wealthy. And that woman, Phyllis, was right. Her grandchildren would now be trying to buy in this market, and short of having the bank of mum and dad, they would find it almost impossible to buy in Australia. It's certainly impossible to buy in a comparable area to where they grew up. What he never spoke about, and people didn't seem to realise until it was too late, was that, sure, mum and dad investors, you can buy a house, it's not going to have too much impact on the housing market. But Howard was helping the investor class. He was helping the already wealthy buy more properties and then create scarcity to ensure that the market would increase to a point where if they sold, they would make a profit. And that's what's happened. You can look at ATO data and you can see that about, I think it's about 2,500 people control more than 30,000 rental properties in Australia. And they're doing that because they've leveraged all of the little tax incentives and all of the little bonuses that Howard had put in place 30 years ago to make it easier that if you have wealth, you can continue to build wealth, and you can also continue to make things a lot more expensive for anybody coming up after you.
Coming up, buying the middle class. Buoyed by the mining boom, Howard funded sweeping tax cuts and rewired the tax system, so higher earners received larger breaks than those on lower incomes. In doing so, he shifted more of the relative burden down the scale, entrenched middle-class welfare and made those concessions politically near impossible to unwind.
So what he did was he basically rebalanced our tax system. So if you were at the higher end of the tax system, you started getting much higher tax breaks than if you were at the lower end of the system. So he just reorganized those tax receipts to better fit his view of the world, which is that if you made money, you clearly deserved more of a break and that we could give that to you.
At the heart of our new tax system lies the largest personal income tax cut in Australia's history, $12 billion, to give Australian workers genuine reward for their efforts.
Before that, we'd had a more progressive tax system where the more you made, the more you paid in income tax. But Howard he didn't, completely put the onus on lower income and middle class income, but he did rebalance it so they were paying a lot more comparatively to what people were paying at the upper ends of the scale. And he built that into the tax system. So essentially that means that anybody coming after Howard could not walk back these tax cuts without paying a massive political cost. And we still see that, we saw that in 2019 when Labor started changing negative gearing and also having a look at, how the tax system was organised.
Bill Shorten's about to take the biggest risk so far as Labor leader. He's going to tackle negative gearing, used by more than 1.2 million.
Everyone knows that negative gearing is overdue for reform. Under Labor's proposal...
We're seeing it now as we're starting to have a conversation again about capital gains tax.
The government is now strongly hinting it's considering changes to the capital gains tax discount, and a growing number of prominent voices have thrown their support.
We saw it with the stage 3 tax cuts, where the Liberals sought to bake in higher tax breaks for higher income earners, which is a continuation of Howard's policy. And they didn't bank the mining boom in any significant way. Like, they did pay off debt, they were famous for that, and they did create the Future Fund, which is basically a big investment pot that the federal government sets up to help pay future bills. And they also set it up, they said, to pay the retirement benefits that were coming to the Commonwealth public servants. So they were aware of the generational load that was coming on the budget. But most of the windfall from the mining boom did get baked into tax cuts and into spending. I mean, if you want to go back to the analogy that Howard and Costello loved using, which is like the household budget, it would be the equivalent of you winning $250,000 on the lotto and then spending for the rest of your life as if you were going to win $250,000 in the lotto forever when you weren't.
Despite saying in the lead up to the 1996 election that he would never introduce a GST.
No way that GST will ever be part of our policy.
Never, ever.
Never, ever. It's dead.
In 1998, he took a 10% goods and services tax to an election. and it nearly cost him government.
We pay enough taxes as it is. I feel it's disgraceful.
Why should it go up? It's only 10 cents, but it does add up in the long run.
So you don't think Mr Howard's going to lose an election over this?
Oh, he will lose the election over this. And I've always voted Liberal.
His government lost the popular vote, with 51% of the two-party preferred result going to the ALP, losing 18 seats in total. But he clung on, and so the GST was pushed through the new parliament.
The introduction of the GST, it did almost cost him government, but he was intent on doing it because, again, to him, that was a very fair way of working out the tax system. The more that you bought, then the more that you individually paid. And that made sense to Howard.
There is no doubt, my fellow Australians, that this country desperately needs a new taxation system.
It's also something that really impacts lower earners and middle-class earners more than it does the rich because they tend to buy more essentials. They're constantly having to buy, the cheap pair of shoes, or they're constantly having to do a grocery shop around those very essential basics that constantly, were propping up the GST. And so he pushed this through as a way of saying this is going to make a fairer Australia, and in return, I'm going to give the states X amount of money.
Every last cent of the GST revenue will go to the states. Every state in Australia over time will have more money to fund the roads, police, schools and hospitals, so important to our daily lives.
And what it did is essentially it's locked the states into requiring GST receipts in order to be able to do anything.
Go cap in hand every time they want something.
Every single time they want something. It's one of the only ways that the states can get money. And, that's why we're constantly talking about raising the GST. But it also ideologically means that we constantly talk about this individual tax, the GST, and raising that rather than taxing multinationals. And every single time, you go to a public hospital or a road isn't built or whatever, the state government will inevitably blame the federal government for not giving them enough in tax receipts. And all of that is just an implicit way to blame individuals for not essentially spending enough and, propping it up. So again, it was Howard readdressing the tax system to put more onus and responsibility on individual taxpayers rather than richer people and corporates who actually could afford to be paying more tax to pay for the services that we all need and use.
And finally, Amy, what has Howard himself said about his legacy in this area, particularly when it comes to housing?
Oh, he has no regrets. Howard has absolutely no regrets. He essentially talks about it as he set up Australia, for generations of wealth.
I'd like them to remember that we tried to boost the Australian economy with a wide range of reforms, such as taxation reform and industrial relations reform, and we didn't get
He will just blame migration for Australians not to be able to afford housing when that's not true. Or he'll blame, supply. Again, that is not true in terms of Australia's population over the last 10 years or so. That increased 16%. Housing stock increased by 19%. But when you take into account, scarcity and distribution, things become very, very uneven. But Howard has not accepted responsibility for any of that. He hasn't accepted responsibility for the way that he set up the budget in terms of the middle-class welfare that he baked in. He hasn't taken responsibility for the fact that the capital gains tax discount just completely obliterated Australia's chances of being able to afford a home. He just essentially falls back on if you work hard enough, you'll be able to get it. It's always about the personal responsibility with Howard, and that's always been his get out of jail free card, in that it's always your fault if you're not getting ahead. So yeah, Howard has not taken any responsibility, but he hasn't taken much responsibility for anything at all that he did to Australia.
Amy, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
In the next episode of The Howard Effect.
Multiculturalism is a concept that I've always had a bit of trouble with. I take the view that if people want to emigrate to a country, it's on the basis that they adopt the values
in the practices and the standards of that country, and in return they're entitled to have the host citizenry respect their culture.
That's tomorrow. See you then.